Okay, thank you, sir.
Thank you. Please
Uh,
start.
Good morning, everyone. Myself, Prerna Rana. I'm working with Professor Arun Mangalam at IIA. And first of all, I would like to thank ASI committee to give me this opportunity. And today I'm going to talk about geometric origin of temporal properties in black hole systems. And this is outline of my talk. First, I'll discuss the generalized relativistic precession model for X-ray QPOs in black hole X-ray binaries. And then I'll discuss another model called the relativistic orbit model for power spectral density in AGN. And then finally, I moved to our very recent work, which is ongoing on deriving condition on 3D periodic orbits in K space-time and their correlation with QPO frequency ratio. And then I'll summarize. So we know that there are three categories of astrophysical black hole in our universe. First is active galactic nuclei and the intermediate mass black holes and black hole X-ray binaries. They are categorized based on their mass ranges and their luminosities. And the observed variability timescales in their light curves is around few hours to days in AGN and few seconds in IMBH and few milliseconds in black hole X-ray binaries. And theoretically, we can clearly see that if we find the frequency of oscillation of matter near the ISCO radius, which is in a more stable circular orbit, then the frequency it matches with the inverse of variability time scale observed in this system. So it is important to study the frequency of oscillation of matter, and that is it is also important to study orbits around a rotating black hole. And for that, we use general relativity and we study K space time, which is the space-time for rotating black hole of mass m dot and angular momentum j. And these are the more general type of orbits that we see in K space-time. On the left-hand side is a non-equatorial centric orbit, and on the right-hand side is a non-equatorial spherical type of orbit where the radius of the orbit is constant. So it is important to understand the variability of these type of orbit to understand the observed variability in various black hole systems. And the variability in black hole X-ray binaries is studied through quasi-periodic oscillation, which are broad peaks in Fourier power density spectrum. And here is a cartoon diagram of black hole X-ray binary. And on right hand side is one example of two simultaneous QPO seen in GROJ 165540 black hole X-ray binary at 300 and 450 hertz. And these QPOs are also seen in low frequency range, which is usually less than 30 hertz, and they're further categorized as type A, B, C based on their observed properties. So to understand the origin of these QPOs, we study relativistic precession phenomena. And on left-hand side, I have shown the periastron precession phenomena, where we can see that if a particle starts from point A and it covers one radial cycle, it precesses to point B instead of coming back to point A. And this precession frequency is given by omega phi minus omega r. And on right-hand side is the nodal precession frequency, where the one vertical oscillation cycle uh, also causes a precession of delta phi angle, and this precession frequency, which is nodal precession, is given by omega phi minus omega theta. So our model is called the generalized relativistic precession model, which was previously studied for circular and equatorial trajectories in K space time, and now we have extended it to non-equatorial and eccentric trajectory, and this work is published in Rana and Mangalam 2028. So in our model, we say that two high-frequency QPOs which are seen simultaneously are azimuthal frequencies and nodal precession, Pareystone precession frequency. And type C LFQPO is the nodal precession frequency. And the frequencies formulae are function of four parameters, which are given here. And here the Carter constant describes the non-equatorial or equatorial behavior of the orbit. And these frequency formulae were derived in Rana and Mangalam 2019. So using this frequency formula, we categorized our model into four categories. First is non-equatorial eccentric orbits, where both eccentricity and Carter constant are non-zero. And then spherical orbits, where eccentricity is zero but Carter constant is non-zero. And then equatorial eccentric orbits, where eccentricity is non-zero but Carter constant is zero. And the simplest case is circular orbit, which was previously studied by Mota et al. 2014. And now we have extended it to other cases. So to apply our model, we have taken case of 5 black hole X-ray binaries where either 3 or 2 simultaneous QPOs were observed, and we have assumed mass and spin of the black hole from previous observations. And here I've shown that for 3 QPOs, we study EQ, E0, Q0 GRPM models, and for 2 QPOs, we study E0 and Q0 models. So we have used a Bayesian type of analysis to find the orbital parameters corresponding to the QPO frequencies. So first we have find the most probable value of the spin by minimizing this chi-square function, and we find for emit to f1 the spin of the black hole should be around 0.299. And then the remaining parameter, that is eccentricity, periosteron point of the orbit, and Carter constant, were found to peak around, for example, eccentricity peaks around 0.24 and periosteron point is 4.7 Rg, and Carter constant is around 2.5. And here we have shown the probability contours in the parameter space. So clearly the solution is eccentric and non-equatorial. And similarly for GROJ 165540, we did not find the exact solution, but we first minimized this chi-square function to find the orbital parameters. And then we fixed the spin of the black hole around 0.283, and then found the remaining distribution of eccentricity, periosteron point, and Carter constant. And in this case, we find that Carter constant peaks at 0, which corresponds to equatorial orbit, and eccentricity is around 0.07, and periosteron point is around 0.25. And these are the probability contours again. So clearly the solution is eccentric and non-equatorial for various cases. And then, but we saw that if we take various trajectories uh, by taking various parameter combination of ERPQ within the estimated range of 1 sigma errors obtained for M82X1 and GROJ, we found that these orbits span a torus region, and here different colors are representing different combination of ERPQ. And this property we found for both M82X1 and GROJ. So clearly this torus region, which is spanned by these orbits, is the origin of QPO. And we also found that GRPM explains the standard Saltes-Bellot-Nicholas correlation. And this correlation was seen for GROJ 165540 by Mota et al. 2014. And we already have a solution for this case. And using that solution, we varied the periosteron point of the orbit, and we found that the observed data points fall on a theoretical curve. So clearly, GRPM explains the PPK correlation also. And then we compared GRPM with a GR fluid model, which was developed by Panna et al. 2012. And this model was for general relativistic thin disk around the Kerr black hole. And in this model, they categorized three regions around the black hole. One is plunge region, edge region, and inner region. And the regions were divided based on gas pressure and radiation pressure, basically which one of them dominates in this region. And for example, plunge region is between ISCO and black hole horizon, edge region is near ISCO, and inner region is outside ISCO. And then they derived the analytic formulae for radial velocity in locally non-rotating frame and gas to radiation pressure ratio as a function of these parameters, where alpha is viscosity and m dot is accretion rate, A is spin of the black hole. And then Mohan and Mangalam 2014 derived the quality factor of QPOs using this beta R expression. And this quality factor is given by this expression. And we utilize this quality factor expression for black hole X-ray binary cases. And here we have shown one example for black hole X-ray binary of mass around 10 solar masses, that in the edge region, these are the contours for Q phi quality factor. So quality factor is very high here theoretically. It is suggesting that edge region should be the origin of QPOs. And also we have shown here that in edge region, the gas to radiation pressure ratio suddenly increases, showing that the gas pressure is very high in this region. So this suggests that the edge region is acting like a launch pad for instability because of high gas pressure. And by comparing GRPM with this model, we found that the torus region that we found for M82X1 and GROJ is overlapping with the edge region and also the plunge region. So this is suggesting that the edge region is launchpad for instability, and these instability are then oscillating in the torus region that we have predicted. And this is following the geodesics around the Kerr black hole with the fundamental frequencies corresponding to the QPO frequencies. And this is the final picture that we obtained, that there is accretion disk and the inner edge of the accretion disk is launching these instability, which are following the torus region, following the orbits in the torus region. And here I have summarized all the results of various models that we studied for various black hole X-ray binaries, and clearly we found eccentric and non-equatorial solution for various cases. And now I'll move to the model for power spectral density shape in AGN. So this is the typical power spectral d-density shape seen in certain narrow line Seyfert galaxies, which is following a broken power curve. So there is a break frequency, and below this break frequency, the slope is around 1, and above the break frequency, the slope is usually around 2 or greater than 2. So To understand this shape and why we see certain shape in various agents, we have developed this model called relativistic orbit model, and this is published in Rana and Mangalam 2020D. So in this model, we assume a prior distribution of energy of particles, and this distribution is assumed to be power law. And we take two distribution for inner corona and outer corona regions. Inner corona is inside ISCO and outer corona is outside ISCO. And we normalize this distribution, and then we translate it to the temporal frequency space using our analytic formulae of the frequencies, which are related with the energy of particles. And then using this distribution in frequency space, we obtain the power spectrum, which is proportional to square of this distribution. So using this model, we obtain that the theoretical PSD indeed follows a broken power law. So here the uh, black dots explain the theoretical PSD, and then it fits with the broken power law, and we have shown the parameters, fitting parameters here for different combination of spin and kata constant. So clearly there is also a break which is corresponding to the ISCO frequency. So ROM model indeed explains the PSG broken power law shape observed in AGN, and this can also be applied to black hole XL binary cases. So this is the final picture that we suggest, that there is inner corona region which is having this non-equatorial type of orbits, and there is outer corona region which is having equatorial orbits. And the inner corona region explains the upper frequency range of PSG, and outer corona region explains the lower frequency range, and there is a break at the ISCO radius. And this edge region is launching the instabilities in the plunge region, explaining the QPOs. And now finally I'll come to our ongoing work on deriving the condition for 3D periodic orbits. So in Kerr spacetime, which is the spacetime for rotating black hole, we say that the ratio of frequencies nu phi, nu r, or nu theta uh, can be written in terms of rational number q phi, q theta. And when such conditions are satisfied, then the orbit close in 3D. So these rational numbers can be further written in terms of various integers, and these integers explain the observed properties of these 3D periodic orbits. So using this condition, we see that using GRPM, if the high frequency QPO ratio is around 3:2, which is usually observed in some of the cases, then we see that using this condition, the Q phi integer should be around 2, corresponding to a particular type of periodic orbit, which is a single leaf orbit, L phi equal to 1, and having two azimuthal walls near the periastron point. And here I have shown one of the example of such 3D periodic orbit, where we can clearly see that there is one big leaf and two azimuthal wall for 3:2 type of orbit. And on left hand side, I have shown the 4 radial periods of the same orbit. So basically, this orbit closes after 4 radial period, which is corresponding to 12 azimuthal cycles, and that is equal to 11 theta cycles. And finally, uh, for periodic orbits, the q phi, q theta rational numbers are definitely function of energy and angular momentum of the orbit. And here we have shown the energy contours and angular momentum contours in q theta, q phi planes. And we see,
I think you should wind up. It's you have 1 minute left.
yeah, I just have 1 minute left. Yeah, thank you. So we see that energy increases as q phi increases, and it decreases as q theta increases. And similarly, angular momentum also follow the same correlation. And these 3D periodic orbits are actually quantized in energy and angular momentum space, and hence these can be shown as various energy level diagrams or angular momentum diagrams. So clearly these levels are corresponding to different q phi, q theta combination. That means they are corresponding to various 3D periodic orbits, and this is suggesting the quantization of the orbit. So now I'll summarize my result. We have extended the idea of relativistic precession model to non-equatorial eccentric orbit case, and we have shown that this fits the Puig correlation GROJ 165540. And within GRPM, we are suggesting that this torus region overlaps with the edge and geodesic region defined by Pan et al. 2012. And this edge region acts like the launch pad of plasma plots. And ROM model is developed to explain the PSD shape in AGN. And then we now plan to test this against observation to extract spin and mass of the black hole. And finally, we are working on deriving condition for 3D periodic orbits in K space-time using fundamental frequencies. And we derive the condition for 3:2 ratio of HF in black hole X-ray binary using this condition. And these orbits are shown to be shown that they can be arranged as energy and angular momentum levels. That means they are quantized in nature. Thank you.
Thank you, Prerna. Let me see if there are any questions. Nothing in the chat box I can see. Is there anything else which anybody would
Chitna, you
like?
can unmute yourself and start.
Oh, hello. So can you go to your very first slide where we're talking about the X-ray binaries, intermediate mass black holes, and AGN thing? Yeah. So I'm just curious to know that how do you know the variability time scale and the break frequency for IMBH?
For IMBH, we do not have the break frequency, but we know the variability times because there are QPOs observed in IMBH cases. For example, MET2X1 is one of the IMBH, and it has frequency of around QPO frequency of around 5 hertz, 3 hertz. So,
And the mass is confirmed to be in 100 to 10 to the 4
yes,
solar
mass
mass?
Yes, mass is around 450 solar mass. I can show you that table. 428 solar mass.
Okay, okay. And the break frequency was just
that is usually seen
assuming,
in AGN.
yeah.
Yeah. No. For studying QPOs, we need not have break frequency. That is for only ROM model, which is for PSG shape in AGN. Mm-hmm. So break frequency we usually know for various AGNs and some of the black hole X-ray binaries.
Yeah. So, but then how do you put that number there? It's just an expectation, extrapolation from what you get in the XRB and AGN
I have not
thing.
put the range for break frequency here. It is just the variability time scale, basically corresponding to QPO frequencies.
Oh, I was thinking that nu phi was probably.
So nu phi is the theoretical value.
Theoretical, yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. I think we should move on now. Let's go to this time Prerna again and move to Pallavi.
Thank you.
Okay, I hope you can see my screen.
Yes, Pallavi, we can now.
Yeah. Thanks, Ranjiv. Hi, Ranjiv. Okay, so this is the work I have done at University of Leeds as a postdoc with Steve Tobias. The other collaborators are Fausto and Gianluigi, and I have recently joined at ICTS as a faculty member. All right, so here I show some observations which go on to motivate us to ask these questions about coherent magnetic fields in the universe. So on the left-hand side, we have optical image of the sun with sunspots, and in panel B is the corresponding magnetogram showing intense magnetic fields in the sunspots. And in panel C is longitudinally averaged radial magnetic field shown to evolve over a period of time. And you can see these like periodic patterns in this evolution. All of this goes to indicate that there is some sort of spatio-temporal organization in these magnetic fields, right? So not only sun, you have galaxies, the spiral galaxy M51 overlaid with radio contours, and there are these yellow lines indicating which come from the polarized emission, the polarization aspect of the emission, and shows the alignment of the magnetic field, and goes to show how it is aligned along the spiral arms of the galaxy. And these again goes to show the presence of these large-scale magnetic fields in the universe. And the most popular paradigm to understand this is what is known as the turbulent dynamo. So one common thing between all of these objects and also planets, stars, accretion disk, galaxy clusters, where all you find these coherent magnetic fields, is that they host turbulence, so the underlying fluid motions are the source of free energy. The one thing that is very important to note is the magnetic Reynolds numbers in all of these systems are like really, really large. And this becomes a sticky point in trying to understand the origin and existence of or evolution of these magnetic fields. Now I want to present like a short physical picture of how this dynamo can work. Here we have a cylindrical system which is being threaded by this poloidal magnetic field. If you have differential rotation, it kind of stretches out the magnetic field into the plane, and that gives us a toroidal magnetic field from the poloidal magnetic field. And that is the easy part. Actually, the trickier part is to get the poloidal field back from the toroidal field. And to do that, we have these helical motions in the fluid. So the kinetic helicity in the fluid basically twists the field lines and brings it back to the poloidal plane. So in this way, in a self-sustained manner, the magnetic field can grow over a period of time. So we have this physical picture, we have a theory for it. So what is the problem? So the problem is that most astrophysical systems have large magnetic Reynolds number, and if any of the processes here are dependent on the magnetic Reynolds number, then we are doomed, because we need to be able to generate fields uh, which are on shorter time scales, on dynamical time scales, and agree with the observations. Like for example, you have this 22-year solar cycle, right? So where does that number come from, etc. So the other important quantity in this problem is magnetic helicity. So it turns out that as you're twisting around the fields, you are growing magnetic helicity. Magnetic helicity is a topological quantity which is a measure of all these twists. And so the question is, can we grow magnetic helicity on fast time scales? So it turns out that if you have a closed domain, then the term that remains in the equation is dependent on the resistivity. So that means that if Rm is really large, then you are growing magnetic helicity very, very, very slowly. But if you have an open domain, then this is the more generalized equation, more general equation, in which there are these other terms which can probably come to save the day. We don't know that. So I have run a set of simulations to study the magnetic field generation in both closed and open domain boxes. And here's the model. So all these runs are with incompressible flow. So density, the continuity equation doesn't appear. Here is Navier-Stokes equation with a forcing function here. This forcing function is based on Galois-Proctor flow, which is like a 2.5 dimensional cellular flow, very chaotic and nice type of forcing. And this is the induction equation, the uncurled version. So since we are working with the vector potential, we are using the winding gauge here. Well, we have also performed studies with comparing different gauges, but I'm not going to talk about that today. Anyway, so this simulation setup, right? So I have run simulations which range in Reynolds numbers from 150 to 600. This is the range in which I have run the simulations. And the two types of boundary conditions, basically for the closed case and the open case. The closed is completely triply periodic. The open case has what is known as vertical field boundary in Y. And stress-free condition for the flow. And the average forcing number that I've employed is about 9. And the initial condition is that in magnetic field, we have weak random fields, and the velocity field is 0 to begin with. I've used the Daedalus code, which is a publicly available Python code. It's a flexible framework to solve all kinds of differential equations. So that's what I've used. So this is my simulation movie. What I'm showing you here is okay, this doesn't okay. Yeah, is the X component of the magnetic field, which grows over a period of time. So you can see these small, tiny things that show up appear in the beginning, and then they grow as the flow, which is sloshing around chaotically, is trying to basically convert the kinetic energy to magnetic energy. But even then, as the time increases, you can see that there is like a large scale pattern that appears, which is basically the large scale dynamo giving rise to these really large scale coherent magnetic fields. So how do I stop this, man? Yeah. Okay. So so the Oh. So one can take the planar averaged 2D kind of plot, make 2D plot out of these boxes by taking averages over 2D domain, and produce what are known as Hofmüller plots. And this is for the 3 different simulations that I've run for 3 different Reynolds numbers. And you can see that there are these large scale patterns that show up, and this is basically what is known as the Beltrami wave. So this is like cos y, sine y, but here it is cos z, sine z, and so on. And this thing is basically that you have a system which is isotropic and homogeneous, but as the magnetic field tries to acquire this large scale structure, it breaks symmetry and varies along a certain direction. That direction is spontaneously chosen. So in this case, it is y, this is z. So this is nothing very new. This has been seen previously, but this it has not been seen with this particular forcing function, which is, yeah. So I just want to show that this does happen in periodic case, closed domain. Also in open domain, non-periodic case, we have a large scale field that comes up. I am not showing you the movie, so I just flash uh, these boxes in front of you to show that over a period of time a large scale field comes up. And if I make a similar plot for it, which are the Hofmüller plots, then again you see these large scale patterns. And in this case we actually know that this by component is going to be 0. By analyzing the boundary conditions, we know that this is the kind of pattern that we actually trivially expect. Okay, so if I take the RMS value of those large scale fields and look at how it evolves over a period of time, then you see this trend with the varying Reynolds number. So as you increase the Reynolds number, the time taken by the simulation with largest RM is actually quite long. So this goes to show that there is some sort of RM dependence in how the magnetic large scale field saturates. In the open domain case, the field is slightly more noisy, but the RM dependence is not actually as strong because the time scale on which it saturates is actually slightly smaller, whereas here it is T equals almost 700, when by the time it saturates, here it is like 300. So yeah, so in this case, though it is not taking a long time to saturate, but the strength of the field that actually comes up is quite much smaller. So here, apart from the k equal to 1 type solution, you also get uniform growth of uniform fields. But again, in the uniform fields, then there is this troubling behavior with the magnetic Reynolds number. So turns out there is a nice correlation between the large scale field and the magnetic helicity. I mean, this is actually quite well known, but here you can see it directly that as you increase the Reynolds number, the time scale on which the magnetic helicity evolves is much longer. But in the open case, that is when you have open boundary conditions, then actually they do evolve on similar time scales, but like I said earlier, the field strengths are kind of smaller. So with this, I will stop the comparison between the closed and open. Within the closed case, there's an interesting behavior that I want to highlight. So we did an interesting set of experiments. What we did is fix the fluid Reynolds number, but vary only the magnetic Reynolds number, and look at the magnetic helicity behavior for the same. So this is the same as the previous case over here, just that I've taken the absolute value of the magnetic helicity. So so you can see the same RM behavior that you saw before. But if I fix the fluid Reynolds number, surprisingly, it turns out that the time scale of variation are not too dissimilar. And this is kind of surprising because you think that the only parameter in the problem that is important is the magnetic Reynolds number. So we were curious what this was about. So I went and looked ahead at so like I showed you before in the magnetic helicity equation, the term on the right hand side is eta j dot b, j dot b being the current helicity. So it's not just the eta, but also the current helicity, which seems to be important. And this has not been uh, shown to be the case. The importance of it has not been shown very much in the previous literature. So this work so it sort of brings that out. So we went and looked at the evolution curves for J dot B, and you can see that this is the closed case. Oh, sorry. This is the case where the RE is varying, and this is the case where RE is fixed. So in the case where RE is varying, actually J dot B takes a very long time to saturate. So, and as opposed to this, if I compare the green curve with the green curve here, the only thing that is varying is the fluid's Reynolds number. So it turns out with the fluid Reynolds number that is smaller, it doesn't take as long to go to zero, and J dot B going to zero means that the magnetic helicity is saturated.
Maybe 1 minute.
Okay, so with this, we wanted to explore this a bit more. So we looked at the analytical aspect of this. So we went and took a look at the current helicity evolution, and splitting into mean and fluctuations, we obtained like a mean field equation for the current helicity. And turns out that the coefficient over here has turbulent transport coefficients. Which means that possibly when the RE is varying, so when RE is varying, the kinetic helicity that is being injected into the system is varying, and that probably goes into dictates the alpha term over here, and which is why we see the kind of behavior that we see. And this is the sort of preliminary conclusion that we have come to. And with this, I actually close my talk. So the summary is that we see the Beltrami fields that we have seen previously, but also we see now with the open domain, there is a growth of uniform fields. And very importantly, in the case of the closed domain, with the magnetic helicity equation, it looks that current helicity is an important term to be dealt with. Okay.
Thank you, Pallavi.
Yeah.
Let's see if we have any quick questions. Nothing in the chat box. Yeah, Suchetna, go ahead if you can unmute.
Oh, Pallavi, very nice talk. Can you go to the slide where we are showing your simulations or some of the snapshots?
Sure.
Yeah, this one. Yes. So what, if I understand correctly, these are the time evolution, right? I mean, t equal to 20, t 50, t 100, t 200 is your time evolution of your magnetic field, and the color bar represents the strength of the magnetic field.
Yeah. So it goes from positive to negative, which is basically indicating oppositely directed. Yeah.
And so what's the length scales in this problem?
So the one length scale is the forcing scale, or the outer scale of the turbulence, which is going to be what I have put in by hand, which is kf equals 9. So 1/9 of the box is one scale. And the other scale is the resistive scale, which is very, very, very small. So you can see that the large scale fields which have come up are on the scale, which is which is on the box scale, which is much larger than the forcing scale.
Yeah, so that's what I was trying to ask, that suppose if I think of some real astrophysical system, let's say planetary system or galaxy clusters, where you look at turbulence, then I would like to be interested to see that how are the scales comparing, like how can I relate these scales to any physical scales in, let's say, a real system?
Right. So I think you mentioned galaxy clusters, right? So,
yeah.
For example, in galaxy clusters, the kind of magnetic fields we have are on the scale of probably this forcing scale itself, because there's no, it's different from galaxies. Galaxies, you have a differential rotation and you have kinetic helicity. So there is large scale dynamo going on there. But we think that in galaxy clusters, there's only small scale dynamo. So you don't get fields which are larger than the forcing scale. And the turbulence outer scale over there, the estimate is from the observations is about 100 kiloparsecs or so. So, or maybe 10 kiloparsecs, I'm not sure. So, so the fields are probably on those kind of scales and not much, not any larger than that. And we have actually done a study of this. I've done this during my PhD, and we've looked at Faraday rotation measures, and looked at what kind of Faraday rotation measures can we get from a small scale dynamo, and how does that compare with what we see from observations, and they match pretty okay.
Great. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I think we should move on now. Let's get Anikita. Anikita.
Yes.
She's going to continue on primordial. She's going to come to minor fields, but primordial fields. And Anikita, please.
Yes. Okay. So hello everyone. I'm Ankita Bera. I'm a research scholar at Presidency University. So I've done this work in collaboration with Dr. Kannan Datta and Dr. Shyamajit Sharma. So today I'll talk on the effect of the primordial magnetic fields on the 21 centimeter signal. So this is a very well-known picture of the cosmic history, where in the lower panel, this is the sky averaged global signal for the most favored standard astronomical model. And these first absorption signal arises due to the thermal decoupling of the cosmic gas from the CMBR. And this period is known as dark ages because at that time there were no sources of light. And once the ionizing astronomical sources start to form, they start to ionize the cosmic gas, and the Lyman alpha photons from these first stars or the first generation of galaxies start to alter the spin states of the hydrogen ground state hyperfine level. So it changes from the higher energy configuration to the lower energy configuration. And as a consequence, the photon gets emitted, which has a wavelength of 21 centimeter or the frequency of 1420 megahertz. And these photons getting redshifted and coming to us right now. And that is the onset of this second absorption profile, which is the 21 centimeter absorption profile. And after that, the X-ray emission from these galaxies leads to heating, and that eventually ends up to the 21 centimeter emission signal. So here we are mainly concerned in these frequency range, 50 to 100 megahertz, because the AGES collaboration, the experiment to detect the global UR signature, they have done their low band observation in this frequency range. And they have claimed to detect the signal from the first stars for the first time. However, there are lots of discussions regarding their detection. So we need further observations to confirm it, and that could be the detection of the global 21 centimeter signal or the spatial fluctuation in the 21 centimeter signal. So the declaration here that we assume this detection to be a valid one and further work on it. So now let us focus on the key results of this detection. They have removed the foreground using polynomial fitting method from the total signal, and these are the best fit values for the model they have chosen. Now there are two issues, the shape of the profile and the size of the profile. Because according to the standard prediction, this profile is supposed to be a Gaussian one. But here we can see this profile is like flattened Gaussian, and the amplitude is almost 2 times larger than the strongest prediction. So now let us realize the factors which play an important role to determine this profile. That is this 1 minus T gamma by Ts, where T21 is the differential brightness temperature, which is the measure of the 21 centimeter signal. And it is determined by the difference between Ts and T gamma, where Ts is the spin temperature, which is determined by the relative population of the hydrogen ground state hyperfine level, that is triplet to singlet, and T gamma is the background radiation temperature, which is mainly governed by the CMBR temperature. So if Ts is greater than T gamma, we get emission signal, and if Ts is less than T gamma, then we get absorption signal. Now, in order to produce the best fit amplitude of AGES 0.5 Kelvin of amplitude, we need T gamma by Ts. This ratio should be greater than 15, whereas this value is 7 in the standard scenario at the center of the profile. So there are two obvious possibilities to increase this ratio. That either we can increase T gamma, for that we need excess radio background, or we can decrease TAs, for that we need colder IGM background. And for the to support the AGES profile, we need T gamma to be greater than 104 Kelvin, or TG should be less than 3.2 Kelvin. Now at this redshift, around redshift 17, the spin temperature and the gas kinetic temperature, they are coupled to each other. So I'm taking TS to be equal to TG. Okay, so now let us realize the role of the gas kinetic temperature here. Through Compton scattering, the TG and T gamma, they are coupled to each other in the very early universe, and both falls as 1 plus Z due to the expansion of the universe. But this coupling becomes ineffective around redshift 150, and the gas temperature starts to fall as 1 plus Z squared due to adiabatic cooling. And the observed profile amplitude by AGES could be explained if TG decouples from TR by redshift 250 instead of 150. So for that, we have considered the colder IGM background in our work. And there are other factors which can change the gas kinetic temperature, and the primordial magnetic field is one of them. Now in literature, we get the upper bound on the magnetic field as 0.1 nanogauss, and from Planck 2015, we get different bounds on magnetic field for different models, but the upper bound of it should be in the range of nanogauss. So in our work, we see that if we consider the colder IGM background, these constraint gets changed by a significant amount. So for the colder IGM background, we have considered the dark matter baryonic interaction here, which is the Coulomb-like interaction, which has a cross section which varies as v to the power minus 4, where v is the relative velocity between the dark matter and the baryon. And for the formalism, the heating or the cooling of the baryon and dark matter, we have taken the formalism from Muniz et al. So here, this cooling term, it is arising due to the temperature difference between these two fluids to reach to a thermal equilibrium. And in our case, the temperature of dark matter is lower than the baryon, so it helps to cool the IGM temperature. But along with the cooling, there is also a heating effect, because as the fluids have different velocity, they will generate a friction between them. So both the fluids will get heated up irrespective of their own temperature. So next we consider the energy dissipation through magnetic field, and there are two processes through which the magnetic energy goes into the IGM: the ambipolar diffusion and decaying magnetohydrodynamic turbulence. Now, in presence of the tangled magnetic field, the Lorentz force acts on the ionized component of the medium, which generates a velocity difference between the ionized and the neutral components, and this relative velocity gets damped due to the ion-neutral collision, which leads to the dissipation of magnetic field energy. And this is the expression for the rate of energy change due to ambipolar diffusion. And these are some quantities on which these rate of change in energy depends a lot, which I'll come later on. And the second process is the decaying turbulence. Now, after recombinations, the radiative viscosity of the medium decreases drastically. So the Reynolds number for the fluid motion becomes very large, which induces this turbulence in the medium, and the energy gets dissipated through this process. Now, this gamma dt, this depends on the Hubble rate and the magnetic energy density. And in general, the magnetic energy density is assumed to fall as 1 plus e to the power 4, but we will see that it gets changed by a little bit. So now we have all the relevant equations, and I'll not go into the mathematical jargon here, but on a simple note, these temperature evolution equation, these first two terms are the standard terms, and the first one is due to the adiabatic expansion of the universe. Second one is due to the Compton scattering. This third one is due to the dark matter baryonic interaction, and the fourth one is due to the primordial magnetic field. And in this magnetic energy equation, if we consider only the first term, the adiabatic expansion, and solve it, then we will get the magnetic field will fall as 1 plus e square, and the magnetic energy will fall as 1 plus e to the power 4. But we will see that if we consider very low magnetic field, then we should consider the decaying of the magnetic energy as well. So we solve these coupled equations simultaneously to determine the gas temperature, and from that we can determine the 21 centimeter brightness temperature as well. So we come to the result, and here we have considered only the effect of dark matter, and there are two free parameters. First one is the dark matter particle mass, and second one is the interaction cross section. And from these panel, we can clearly see that if we consider a very high cross section, then the IGM temperature gets decoupled from the CMBR temperature very early. And after reaching to thermal equilibrium, both the temperature falls as 1 plus Z square. And as I have already described, that there are two effects due to DMB interaction: cooling due to temperature difference and heating due to friction. The heating becomes dominating for M chi greater than 1 GeV. And in our case, we need faster cooling of the IGM. So we can rule out the dark matter mass greater than 1 GeV in this scenario. And in lower panel, the ionization fraction is plotted. As the temperature decreases, the ionization fraction as a hydrogen recombination rate actually increases, which reduces the residual free electron fraction by a significant amount. And Xe gets reduced by a factor of almost 5 when we consider this combination. So the detailed description on how the dark matter baryonic interaction can change the recombination history we have described in this paper, which I'll not go into detail here. And next we consider the effect of the primordial magnetic field only. And for that we have taken throughout our analysis, we have taken the spectral index in B to be minus 2.9 to be fixed. And we find that if we consider the magnetic field greater than 0.03 nanogauss, we start to see some significant changes in the temperature. And as I have previously mentioned, the dependencies of energy rate due to ambipolar diffusion and decaying turbulence, those factors play an important role here. The ambipolar diffusion becomes dominant at lower redshift because it is inversely proportional to the square of the baryon density and the temperature, whereas the decaying turbulence term, which is proportional to the Hubble rate and magnetic energy density, the effect of this term gets diluted at lower redshift. And we find that if we consider 0.1 nanogauss magnetic field, then T21 becomes 0. And if we further increase the magnetic field, then it will cross the CMBR temperature and the 25 centimeter signal will grow from absorption to emission. So that is completely ruled out by AJ. So we get the upper bound from here as 0.1 nanogauss, which is similar to the finding of Minada et al. In the standard scenario. And here Xe increases by a factor of around 1.5 if we consider the magnetic field of 0.5 nanogauss. So in the bottom panel, we have plotted the normalized magnetic field to highlight any deviation from the standard 1 plus Z square scaling. And we find that decaying of magnetic field is prominent for redshift less than 100, that is during dark ages and cosmic dawn. And there is one more important result, that the fractional decay is more if the magnetic field is weaker. So when we are dealing with the low magnetic field, we better consider the decaying part along with the adiabatic term, which I have shown earlier. So next is the effect of primordial magnetic field in presence of DMB interaction, and we have taken different combinations of dark matter mass, cross section and magnetic field. And some of these combinations are given in this table. And we can allow and discard these combinations by considering the ages bound, that is T21 should be in between minus 0.3 Kelvin to minus 1 Kelvin. And the magnetic field the magnetic field is 0.1 nanogauss, which is ruled out in the standard scenario. We can allow that magnetic field if we consider a certain set of parameters. And even we see that the magnetic field 0.4 nanogauss can also be allowed if we tune the dark matter mass and cross section. Now, if we see the green curve, then at lower redshift, due to the decaying of magnetic field, the heating becomes ineffective and the IGM temperature is mainly governed by the DMB interaction. So it gets lowered from the standard scenario. So from here we can conclude that the heating due to the magnetic field cannot explain the rise of the absorption profile during cosmic dawn, and we need other astrophysical radiations like X-ray or the dark matter annihilation or something like that to explain that part. So this is the contour plot of dark matter mass and cross section, which demonstrates the allowed region for different magnetic field. And from here we can see that if we increase the magnetic field, the dark matter mass has a tendency to go to a lower value region, whereas the cross section goes to a higher value region. So to summarize, I'll briefly point out the importance of the colder IGM background to study the magnetic field. that it suppresses the residual free electron fraction, which increases the heating rate due to amipolar mechanism. And the coupling coefficient between ionized and the neutral component decreases, which in turn also increases the heating rate. And the Compton process, which is proportional to the IgM temperature and the ionization fraction, that also gets affected due to lower Tg. So collectively, all these effects make the heating rate due to magnetic field faster compared to the standard scenario. So in our case, we can have an upper bound as high as 0.4 nanogauss in the context of colder IgM, which is completely ruled out in the standard scenario. So the final conclusion is the role of primordial magnetic field on a colder IgM background will remain valid for any mechanism which can provide faster cooling of the IgM. So I end here.
Thank you, Ankita. Let's see if you have any questions for you.
Okay.
Any questions? You can raise hands or unmute. Yes, Indulekha, please go ahead if you can unmute.
I just wanted to check whether these bounds which you have provided on the dark matter particle mass and the cross section, how do they compare with the bounds put from the dark matter experiments themselves?
Okay, so this is the bound actually we get from CMB and Lyman alpha, and these bounds is mostly above 10 GeV dark matter mass, because in the lower end of dark matter mass, we don't have that much observations. So the bound we get is greater than 10 GeV. So we have we have changed the dark matter mass in the lower bound, keeping in mind that we need some sensible dark matter mass of the cross section, so that we can at least contribute something to the observation.
Okay.
So this is the point we get from observation.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Ankita. Now let's move to Atanu.
Thank you.
So can you see my screen?
We're just seeing slides. Yeah, now we can start the presentation. Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So my name is Atanu Kole. I am a PhD research scholar at ISC Bangalore. So today I am going to talk about the magnetic field estimation in photodissociation region, and this work is primarily based on this paper that in MNRS. So magnetic field is everywhere in the universe, in Earth, in Sun, in interstellar medium, in galaxies, in protoplanetary disks, in molecular cloud. In all fields, magnetic field is there, and the matter's dynamics is governed by this magnetic field. And the range of this magnetic field is also huge, from micro Gauss to 10 to the power 13, 14 Gauss. And it is an important essence to study the magnetic field in this astrophysical system. So I will be talking about the magnetic field in this molecular cloud region. So this is the cloud that I have studied, the DR21 molecular cloud, and it is in the Cygenius X complex. And this DR21 molecular cloud distance is 1.5 kpc, and the plane of the sky projected is 2 arc minute. And from the right figure, you can see that the OB star clusters is there, and the radiation is, due to this radiation, the outer envelope is expanded, and this is called the photodissociation region. And in this photodissociation region, the physics and chemistry is governed by this far ultraviolet radiation field, and it is an important essence to measure the magnetic field there, because in that photodissociation region, from this photodissociation region again star formation will occur. And to study this region, I have chosen the OH radical. So its ground state is split into 4 lines: 1612, 1615, 1667, and 1720. Among these 4 lines, 2 lines are main lines, and 1665 and 1667, and other 2 lines are satellite lines. And each of these line is further splitted due to the magnetic field. And from the right figure, you can see that one single line where magnetic field is not there, and when magnetic field is there, is split into three lines. The unshifted line is the pi line, and the two shifted line is the sigma line. So if we see any arbitrary angle from with respect to the line of sight magnetic field, we can see that all contribution of these lines from the sigma lines and the pi lines. And in the telescope, where the telescope is sensitive to the right circular polarization and left circular polarization, each of these line pi and sigma components contribute there. And in ideal case, from the right and left circular polarization, from the resultant shift, one can measure the magnetic field and also the relative intensities of this line. One can measure the theta term, that is the angle between the magnetic field and the line of sight. But in the small splitting approximation, this approximation is that when the magnetic field is small, because in interstellar medium magnetic field is of the order of microgauss or milligauss, and the lines are further broadened due to the thermal and the non-thermal broadening. And in this scenario, the three lines are merged into a single line. So one can see only the one line for left circular polarization and one line for right circular polarization. And in this scenario, the b and cos theta cannot be measured independently. Rather than one can only get the b cos theta component. And in this small splitting approximation, Stokes v, q, and u turns into this kind of form. But from the q and u, one cannot get any information because it is a second derivative of I, and the signal to noise ratio is very small. So only one can fit the I and the V profile and get the line of sight magnetic field. That is what exactly I did with the OH line. So in the OH 1665 and 1667 lines, there are 9 components is there, and each of these components I have independently checked the magnetic field. And as di by d nu is high for this narrow line, so the probability of measuring the magnetic field is high for this narrow deep line. And that is, I have measured the magnetic, get the 3 sigma magnetic field for this narrow line for both 1665 and 1667 line. And other component, only one signature is there in the right hand side, but no such magnetic field is detected. And for this narrow line, the magnetic field that I obtained is 137 and 123 microgauss, and within the uncertainties, both are same. But this is only the line of sight magnetic field. But to study the different theoretical model, one requires the total magnetic field. So the other component, the plane of sky magnetic field, to study the plane of sky magnetic field, Chandrasekharan Fermi method is there. And in this DR21 cloud, with the Chandrasekharan Fermi method, the average magnetic field that have been detected is 3 milligauss. But we have not added this component with our Zeeman result because the telescope's resolution is different. And from the figure, you can see that in a molecular cloud, magnetic field are bent, twisted, and when we added the different component, it is required to telescope same resolution. Otherwise, one can get the error result. So that's why we have not added the other components. Rather than we have assumed some possible orientation with respect to the line of sight, and each of these orientation we calculate the mass to flux ratio for theta equal to 0, 60, and 80 degrees. And we have seen that in each of these orientation, the lambda c is greater than 1. That means we are tracing the magnetically supercritical envelope where magnetic field is not dynamically important. And also, not only that, we have also studied the plasma beta and another energy densities, and we have seen that the magnetic energy density is always less compared to the hydrodynamic and thermal energy densities. So thereafter, we have plotted our result with the Krachar result. So in Krachar, they have studied the magnetic field and density and do the Bayesian statistic and fitted the upper envelope of this result. And they have found that up to 300 particle per semicube, there is no such correlation, which is exactly the B figure, where magnetic field is dominate the gravity and the matter will flow along the magnetic field line. That's why there is no such correlation in the neutral medium. Thereafter, the correlation will started where gravity dominates, and they have found the B total is proportional to 10 to the power 0.65, which is closely related to the H figure, where spherical contraction is there. Here we just plotted this thing to show that where our data points lie. Not only that, we have also studied the kinematics in this region. For that, we have measured the radio recombination line, which is coming from the ionized region, and we have seen that, and also we have taken the C2 line from the archival. So we have seen that the radio recombination line have spectral symmetry with respect to the uh, systematic velocities, but which line has certain dip into in the uh, red shifted region, and this is due because of the fact that PDR that we are tracing is only the four that is which is along our line of sight. We only see this PDR, not the back side, and that's why the which is uh, intensity suddenly dropped. But as we are seeing the whole region from this ionized region, that's why the H2 radio recombination line have broad spectral symmetry in these two lines. And also in the C2 line, that the red line, there is certain drop in the 9 kilometer per second, and this is due to the fact that one foreground line cloud is there, which is absorbing this C2 line, which is also observed in OH line also. And from this figure, we can also see that the dynamics are very complex. 9 components is required from in this resultant Gaussian, and one is coming from this broad region, which is the believed to that it is coming from an star's outflow. So in our study, we have also detected some major line with the nearby line of sight DR21OH and W75S FR1, but we have not detected the magnetic field through the major line because in our case the telescope resolution was not good, because in for OH line the major lines are coming from the 10 to the power 15 centimeter region. So these are very clumpy region from their major emission is coming. So that's why we have detected the resultant RR and resultant LL, but which RR will correspond to which LL, that we don't know, and that's why we cannot measure the magnetic field in this region. Rather, we have studied the variability. So VLA is our data and VLBA is the old archival data. So we have plotted the resultant RR and resultant LL in these regions, and we have see the variability. So you can see from this figure that here VLA there in minus 4 kilometer per second, there is a sudden 10 peak is high, but here in 2005 data there is drop, and this is due to the fact that major lines are strongly variable source, and it depends on the pumping sources, and if the sources intensity or something decreases, then the effect will be seen in the major line. And also in 1667 and 16 VLB and VLA data, this kind of variability is also noticed. So to summarize the talk is that we have measured the line of sight magnetic field in this region, and the magnetic field is 130 microgauss. In our observation, OH observation, we have also seen that OH line is spectrally asymmetric. We have also detected the Coulomb density in this region, and this is the 10 to the power 16 order. We have also detected the major lines in the nearby line of sight from this DR21 OH and W75 SR1, and we have also calculated the energy density and mass to flux ratio in this DR21 main region. I have seen that thermal and hydrodynamic energies dominate the gravitational, and gravitational energies dominate the magnetic energy densities. So thank you.
Thank you, Atanu. Nice. We have time for some questions. Baswari, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Atanu. Nice talk. I just have a question regarding your PDR analysis. Maybe you can go back to your presentation, then it's easier for me to point out. So I noticed that you have used some C plus line at 158 microns. So which data is that? Where is that data from? Is it Harshal data? The
this
C2
C
line from 150.
yeah, this is from the Herschel data. Yes.
Yeah, so this is from, but you do not see this absorption, like the absorption actually would go to, if you subtract the continuum, it will go to negative values. How come you do not see that? Because if you look at Marivon Guerra's paper, she has actually done this. It was observed as a part of the Prismas program. And if you look at this figure B.16, you can see. So, and there is a nice comparison with C1. So anyways, this is just, you probably have not looked into it.
Yeah.
Any other question, possible?
No.
Or anybody else would like to ask a question to? If not, then let's move to Suman. Suman, can you share the screen?
Yeah, hello. Am I audible?
No, you're audible, but you can't sharing your screen.
Yes, just 1 minute. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it is visible, isn't it?
Yes. Okay. Start.
Hi, myself Suman Bala. Today I am going to present a possible physical explanation of the observed anharmonic ratio between the cyclotron line energies of the source safe exports. Now, first question is, what is cyclotron line? Now, when a charged particle enters in a magnetic field, it experiences a Lorentz force, F is equal to Q into V cross B. So the force is perpendicular to its velocity. Now, because of this force, it moves in a circular motion, and the frequency of this circular motion is known as cyclotron frequency. Now, for a high magnetic field and high velocity, the quantum effect dominates, and this perpendicular component of momentum and energy is quantized, and those are known as Landau quantization. And any transition between this Landau level gives rise to cyclotron photons. So basically, for cyclotron line, or anything for cyclotron frequency, we need two things. One is charged particle and another is magnetic field. So neutron star is one of the prime source of high magnetic field in the sky. And in the neutron star, the charged particle is actually supplied by the companion star when it is in binary system, this normal star. The charged particle is supplied to the neutron star via Roche-Low overflow or stellar wind accretion. Now, while this charged particle falling on the neutron star surface at some distance, where the magnetic field energy is greater than the kinetic energy of the charged particle, this magnetic field lines actually dominates over the kinetic energy, and this magnetic field lines guide the charged particle to the pole of the neutron star. So charged particle follows the magnetic field line, go to the pole of the neutron star. At the pole of the neutron star, this charged particle goes through a standing shock and slowly settle down and form an accretion mound. This is a typical accretion picture for neutron star polar curve accretion. And this dense mound is radius is around 1 kilometer, and the flow above this accretion mound of charged particle is known as accretion column. So people assume that the cyclotron line is generally produced in the optically thin region, either in the column, and if the column is not opaque, then optical thin region at the top of the mound surface, this yellow region. Now, this observed cyclotron line is often found to have many harmonics, which is expected from these quantum laws. Now, but the observed line often found to be non-integral ratio. So possible thing could be quantum physics is wrong, which is not the case. There are another reasons behind this anharmonic ratio. One of the prime example is safe export, where in 2015, Jaswal and Nayak, they have observed two cyclotron line. One is around 27 to 30 kV, another is 42 to 46 kV. So using Suzaku data, this source has been shown to another cyclotron line, distorted cyclotron line. We are not going into detail in that, but as you can clearly see, the ratio is well below 2. So what could be the possible reason behind this anharmonic ratio? So theoretically, it has been shown that a deviation from this anharmonic ratio can be assumed while including the relativistic effect. But in that case, the deviation is well below 10 to 20%. But in this case, it is the deviation is huge. People also assume that the field of neutron star is not simple dipolar. There may be higher order, multiple term, which can give rise to this anharmonic ratio. And also, in literature, people explain that actually we observe different part of the accretion column in different phases, or maybe different height of the accretion column, which basically we are observing different magnetic field intensity, and thus we are observing different regions simultaneously. In a collective effect, we are observing an harmonic cyclotron line. In 2012, Mukherjee and Bhattacharya, they have shown that the presence of accretion mound at the pole can distort the magnetic field of the neutron star. And this distorted magnetic field gives rise to this anharmonic ratio. So in this work, we have extended the work of Mukherjee and Bhattacharya to physically explain the observed anharmonic ratio of safe export. To explain, so we assume this mound is steady state equilibrium. It is parabolic in shape and axisymmetric, and it follows ideal magneto-hydrodynamic equation. And we solve this equation numerically to find the magnetic field distribution inside the accretion mound. In this figure, you can see in the x-axis, we have plotted the radius of this accretion mound. In the y-axis, z is the height of the mound. These solid black lines are the magnetic field lines, and the red dashed line is the mound. So we have plotted the figure for mound 65, 75, and 95 meters. Now you can see as the mound height increases, magnetic field lines are bending, more and more to support this gravitational pressure of this accretion mound. So there is a change in the magnetic field intensity inside the mound. And here we have plotted the magnetic field intensity at the top of the accretion mound, because as I have already mentioned, the cyclotron line is actually produced in the top part of the accretion mound, because that part is only optically thin. So at the top of the accretion mound, you can see the magnetic field. We have started with 2 × 10⁻12 Gauss, but because of the presence of accretion mound, the magnetic field changes significantly. So this is the reason we are actually, although the neutron star has this intrinsic magnetic field of 2 × 10⁻12 Gauss, but we can observe this huge variation of the magnetic field. Now, to model the cyclotron line or cyclotron shape, what we have done, we have divided the surface of this accretion mound into small element, and we have taken the weightage average from all the elements. And to get the shape of cyclotron feature, what we have done, we have assumed it to be Gaussian, and width and depth of the line we have taken from the result of Monte Carlo simulation of Sonar et al. 2007. So after setting all this picture, so how does the cyclotron looks like? So if we assume that only one fundamental line is there, the cyclotron line looks like this. As you can see, for the mound height 60 meter and the magnetic field 2 × 10⁻12 Gauss, the cyclotron line is simply pure Gaussian. As the mound height increases to 65 meter, there is a slight distortion. If we go further, if for mound height 75 and 95 meter, there is a huge distortion in the fundamental line. And these two peaks need not to be integral ratio and directly dependent to the mound height for a given magnetic field. So for the SAPEX4, it is possible that we are observing one fundamental line, but which is actually distorted because of the presence of accretion mound. While explaining, this feature observed in SAPEX4, we assume that there could be another reason, that this might be two cyclotron line, fundamental and second harmonic, but both the lines, harmonics are distorted because of the presence of the accretion mound. Now, so in our simulation, what we have done, we have included two lines. One is first and second harmonic, and check how does this get affected by the presence of accretion mound. Now you can see this is the fundamental line and this is the second harmonic. As you can see, with the presence of accretion mound, both the lines are getting distorted. As we increase the mound height for a given magnetic field, the shape of cyclotron line is quite complicated and it is quite complex. Now, to compare these two models, that the observed cyclotron line in SAPEX4, either a distorted fundamental cyclotron line or two harmonic but distorted due to the due to the presence of accretion mount. So to compare these two models, we have created a table model for XPEC. In our model, we have only two parameters. One is intrinsic magnetic field of the neutron star, and another is mount height. And we have tabulated, the simulated spectra for different parameter of magnetic field and mount height. Without primary calculation, we come to know if we assume a fundamental line which is distorted and gives rise to the shape of the shape export, the magnetic field would be 5.2 into the 12 Gauss, and the mount height is this 58 to 72 meter. And if we assume that both fundamental and first line are present, the magnetic field would be 3 to 4 into 12 Gauss, and the mount height would be 40 to 55 meter. So assuming these parameter values, we have tabulated all the spectrum. We have simulated all the spectrum. We have stored as a table model in the XPEC to directly fit with the observed spectrum. Now, this is the best fit, parameter values. As you can see, we have fitted two, model, H-card model and FD card model. I would like to refer this Jaiswal paper because we have used the same continuum what they have used. So with this two continuum, we get there is a huge change or improvement in terms of chi-square by degrees of freedom after including our model, the cyclosym 1 and cyclosym 2, both. So you can see this is the value without any line, and these are the values after including our model, our table model or cyclotron line. Now, from our fitting, we can clearly see the fit is better in case where we assume that these are two cyclotron line, but actually distorted by the presence of magnetic field. And with this assumption, we get the magnetic value of the magnetic field, the intrinsic magnetic value of neutron star is 3.3 into 12 Gauss around, and the mount height to be 46 meter. So with our current work, we can physically explain this anharmonic ratio as a distorted cyclotron line, and because of this accretion mount. So here is the conclusion. With our analysis, we get that the cyclotron line can be explained as a distorted fundamental line as well as two harmonic, where both are distorted by the presence of accretion mount. And we find then the latter can be explained the observed features in the shape export better. And with our model, we find the intrinsic magnetic field of neutron star is around 3.3 into 12 Gauss, and the mount height is around 46 meter. Thank you.
Thank you, Suman. We have time for questions. Yes, Varun, please go ahead.
How easy or difficult is it to adapt this to other neutron stars? And the second question is, how sensitive is this to the viewing geometry, the angles between the rotation and magnetic axis and the observer?
Okay, so let me answer the first question. So second question first. So it is dependent on this viewing geometry and other things. That is beautifully mentioned in Deepanjan's paper, the Deepanjan 2012 paper. So yes, it is it is dependent, and we can basically people can do, they can compute those parameters, viewing angle or the other things from observation and include in the simulation. Or what we can do, we can make those parameters a variable in our simulation. But you can understand, if we include two more parameters, then the simulation will be large and it will take long time. And then we can fit for those parameters also. So both way it is possible. One can find out those parameters and directly input to our model and trying to play with only two parameters, B and Z. Another thing is we can include those parameters in our model. Then we'll have four parameters. The viewing angle and geometry, those things you can include. Then we'll increase the number of parameters in our model. That's all. And I've forgotten your first question. Can you repeat it again?
They were how easy is it to adapt this to another system?
Okay, so basically, as I have shown in this slide, so with our primary calculation, so what we can do, we can basically do this simulation for a lots of values, but it will take a long time, which can include most of the system. So basically with our primary calculation, we get some idea what could be the range of the parameter, such that all this simulation will take some time to run, isn't it? So if we have basic idea about the parameter values, then we can stick with those parameter values. If we want to use this simulation for general purpose, so basically we have to include all those magnetic field values which has been observed, physically observed from data analysis, and the range of mount height which can predict all these things. So the answer is either you can create, you can primarily calculate this parameter value and create this parameter for every system, or it will be a huge table model which can actually explain most of the system. Both is possible.
Okay, thanks.
Any other quick questions? If not, move to last talk ring. Akash, could you please share your screen?
Yeah, please give me a minute. Yeah, is it visible?
Yes, you can go to full screen now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Please start.
Yes, okay, thank you. Okay, hi everyone, I'm Akash. I want to first thank organizers for letting me present in the 39th meeting of ASI. I'll be talking about our work, modeling the energy dependent fractional RMS and time lapse in MAXI J1535571 as observed by AstroSat. This is an ongoing work and it's in collaboration with my supervisors, Dr. Smashri Singh from Jamia Millia Islamia and Professor Anjeev Mishra from IUCAA. So this is a brief plan of my talk. I'll go through black hole X-ray binaries and then talk about variability seen in X-ray emission from the systems, and then talk about modeling of timing behavior associated with this variability. Then I'll compare with AstroSat observations, and then I'll conclude. So black hole X-ray binary contains a normal star and a black hole, as you can see in this right picture. And owing to extreme gravity, black hole accretes matter from this normal star and thereby forms an accretion disk around it. Now, the gaseous matter in this accretion disk possesses gravitational potential energy, which is then emitted out in the form of X-rays, and which is what we receive using different satellites in space. Now, what you are seeing is a hardness intensity diagram. On y-axis, there is X-ray intensity. On an x, there is X-ray hardness. And each of the point in this plot represents a possible state of black hole X-ray binary. And usually it is seen for several binaries that they start from quiescence and goes into outburst, and thereby passing through low Hart state, um, which is low luminosity and hard spectrum, and then shifts to high soft state and then returns back to quiescent state. Apart from this, what is seen is highly variable light curves in the X-ray emission. So like in the left panel, you can see the light curve for this popular binary GRS 1915 plus 105. You can see how variable the photon flux is with respect to time. So to study it in a better way, we can take the amplitude squared of its Fourier transform to get power density spectrum as in this right picture. And you can see all these narrow peaks here, which in literature are known as quasi-periodic oscillations. So people have been trying to ascertain the origin of these QPOs, and there are different ways. One possible way is to identify the QPO frequency with different theoretical models, like Ingram et al. In 2009. They used lens theory precession and related GR frequencies with the QPO. Then Tatarchuk et al. In 2000, they considered disk oscillations between compact object and disk. And then Chakrabarti et al. In 2000, they studied this shock oscillation model. And then there are many more works. But besides this, there is another possible way we can identify this radiator process that can give rise to QPO. So like Belloni et al. In 2000, they related the characteristics of QPO with different spectral states of BHX-ray. In 2009, Bhargava et al., they showed a tight correlation between power law index and QPO frequency. Then in 2016, Mead et al., they developed a Dwight model where they considered variations in spectral parameters in order to explain the temporal behavior. Then there is also this work, Magul et al. In 2019. They also developed this one-zone stochastic propagation model. So we are working on the same lines in order to explain the temporal properties possessed by QPOs, which are energy dependent. So first one is fractional root mean square. So this is basically measurement of signal amplitude as a fraction of total source flux. We can compute it by taking the square root of the net power, which is integrated over some range of frequency. Another property is time lag. So it is possible to compute this delay between two signals which are simultaneously detected but in different energy bands. So if you get a positive lag, it means that soft photons are being emitted before hard ones. So given this, we want to model this timing behavior, and we need as a step one the time averaged photon spectrum. And for several binaries, it is seen that it's dominated by two radiative components mainly. The one which is coming from the outer disk, and it's basically blackbody spectrum. And then another one is coming from the inner regions, the thermal Compton spectrum, which is supposedly coming from some coronal cloud. Now, there's a NASA software expect which can model both these components using some inbuilt models like disk BB and NTHCOM. So you can see in the left plot, the disk BB dominates at lower energies, whereas NTHCOM is dominating at higher energies. And there are inbuilt parameters for these models, like there is KT in inner disk temperature, normalization in disk. For NTHCOM, there are electron temperature, spectral index, and all these parameters. But it's important to highlight at this point that all these parameters uh, may not have one-to-one correspondence with the physical parameters. So that's why we translated them into physical parameters. So like 18 goes into accretion rate and end disk into inner disk radii and so on. So once we have obtained the information about the spectrum, we can vary it with respect to all these parameters. So like in the left panels, you can see the variation with respect to seed photon temperature, the inner disk temperature of disk. And in the top plot, you can see the spectrum changing, and corresponding to that, the RMS gives this pivot point at some higher energy in the RMS versus energy. We can also bring variations in heating rate. You can see how the spectrum is changing in the right panel, top panel, and in the bottom one, the fractional RMS is again giving this pivot point, but at lower energies. But these are individual variations. We can also take variations in all of them together and can calculate the first order variation in the spectrum as whole using this relation here, and then calculate RMS and phase lag using these simple relations. So in the bottom panels, you can see the theoretical predictions of RMS versus energy and time lag versus energy for some arbitrary values. And we wanted to see how they work with observations. So we are using AstroSat observation. It's an Indian multi-wavelength observatory, and it contains 5 payloads, and we are using S60 and LaxPC data. S60 covers soft X-ray range of 0.3 to 8 keV, and LaxPC covers of 3 to 80 keV, and it has a good timing resolution of 10 microseconds, and which makes it possible to do timing analysis. So we are using, in our second work, we are using AstroSat observation of this object, black hole X-ray binary, MAXI J1535571. The AstroSat observations have been studied earlier also. Shriyari et al., Sridhar et al., and Bhargava et al. In 2019, they reported LFQPOs, low frequency QPOs for this object. So in the right panels, in the top one, you can see the time evolution of the QPO frequency in all the segments. And for one particular segment, I have given a power density spectrum, and you can see that there is a sharp QPO at 2.197 Hertz. For this particular segment, we obtained the photon spectrum, which is being observed by 16 lakhs PC20 in 1 to 30 keV. And we then use this model, expect model, constant times TVAPS times THCOM plus, times plus PV. So this THCOM is a modification of NTHCOM, and we obtained all these parameters in the table here. So again, so as we obtained the information about spectrum and the parameters, we then started fitting the temporal behavior, RMS and time lag. And we took this model where we are considering variations in inner disk temperature, then variation in scattering fraction, and then after a delay, there is variation in coronal heating rate. So as you can see, it's able to fit somewhere the characteristics, the temporal characteristics. And the physical picture which emerged is something like this. So the perturbation, the variation is somewhere originating in the outer region, according to this model. And then it traveled inwards. And after a delay, it brings variations in increase in the heating rate as well. So we find that this picture works for this segment, but we want to see how it works in all the other segments. But before that, we did the spectral fitting for all the segments, and we obtained this time evolution of spectral parameters. You can see the gamma is varying with respect to segments, but the KT somewhere uniform around some value, 0.2 value. So we wanted to see if we get the same kind of correlation as observed by Bhargava et al. So we do get some relation between gamma and QPO frequency, but it's little scattered at some point. So we are working on this. And after this, we will be fitting the model parameters, the numerical model for all the segments. And we'll be see how it gives us information about the accretion disk. So please stay tuned for further work. And these are my conclusions. So we are working on this generic scheme where we can estimate variations of spectral parameters in order to explain timing behavior. Now, since we have large number of observations of this object, we hope to get evolution of different model parameters and if possible, see any correlations. And the last point that I want to highlight is that this technique can consider important features like absorption, reflection, that will help us to get the better idea of accretion dynamics. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Akash. We'll see if you have any questions. Yes, Yash, please go ahead.
So you have used a basic model for modeling the disk, which is this BB. So do you plan to use higher like Kerr disk or KERD? Like because
Yes,
that will
yes.
give
So,
you a accretion rate directly
yes, yes.
and include
So,
the factor.
yes. Yes, so it's important to understand that as we go on to these complex models, the number of parameters will increase. So the parameter space will increase. So, but yes, we are developing the code in this manner that any XSpec model can be put into it, and we can then see what variations of spectral parameters can generate the temporal characteristics. So yes, maybe possibly we can use the KERD as well.
Also, in your QPO versus
Yes.
the QPO versus QPO versus gamma slide, you have a very large error bar on QPO frequency, which is very weird because QPO is pretty tightly constrained in almost all the segments, at least in my case.
Yes, exactly. So we are working on this, and so one thing that we have noticed is basically the division of segments, the way you have divided in your work, and the way we are choosing. So yes, but yeah, it's still ongoing. We are still figuring it out how we can reduce the error bars on this.
Because
Yes.
That's quite weird because QPOs are typically very tightly constrained because this source shows very nice QPOs.
Yes. So we are trying to figure it out.
Okay.
Yes, Jitesh. Jitesh, you can go ahead.
Yeah. Hi, Akash. So I just want to ask you about see the model that you use. I mean, you included the discussion of voltage from the.
I'm sorry, Jitesh. I can't hear you. Can you?
Can you hear?
Yeah. Now you're.
Hello. Hello.
Yeah. Hello. Yeah. Now you're audible.
Hello.
Yes.
Yeah. So you use the disk as well as the MTH-COM model, right? But in the AstroSat,
Yes,
I mean,
yes.
you only cover the like the hard part. So how you make sure that I mean like the disk contribution here? I mean, you don't have the data like below like 3 kV or something.
So you're asking how? So are you asking like whether we consider the disk parameters also or not? Is it the question?
You use, I mean, for the spectrum, you use disk as well as the MTH-COM. But for the timing, I mean, you have only the hard component, right?
Yeah, no. So in the timing analysis also for the timing fitting, we are taking variations in disk parameters. So like in this model, there is variation in inner disk temperature.
Yeah, that's true. But you don't have a data below 4 kV or 3 kV, right?
Oh yes.
How do you?
Yes. So that's yes. So yes. Yes. So it will work. This analysis will work if we consider like another satellite like NICER, which covers the lower energy range.
Yes.
Yes. So yeah.
So do you plan to, I mean, like include the NICER for this?
Yes. That is the plan also.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions for? If not, let's thank all the speakers. Update your time and now hand over to the host if required. If there are any announcements.
Harvinder may know, but I don't think there are any announcements. But thanks everyone for this session and.
Yeah, and people, this is poster session afterward at lunchtime also. So people who are presenting posters, could you please just interact with them also? Because this is officially Dignigrity poster session, I think. Yeah, that's all.
Okay.
So should I close the session?
Yes, please. Okay. Thank you.
We'll end the session now. Okay.
Yeah.
I can't, and you are the host. I'm co-host, so you have to do that.
I'm ending the session now.
Oh, acha, okay, fine.
I'll stop the